great.
So it's really just, so when you get an assignment for a web piece or you're pitching to a web publication, there's the SEO need for, the article. And sometimes it feels like those terms and those words that have to be in there go along with that boring travel writing that you kind of described, that what everyone else is doing. So how do you tell that dynamic, alive story within those constraints of the publications that need that SEO, search engine optimization so that people can find it and the right terms and all that kind of thing?
That's interesting. So at Good Beer Hunting, luckily, SEO isn't something that ever has any bearing on our editorial. So we are kind of lucky in that way that has never really been a consideration. At the same time, I used to do a lot of copywriting for TripAdvisor, and that was peak kind of cramming SEO keywords into stories. And you're right that it is hard and limiting because those publications, if those are the keywords, they're also probably invested in that certain narrative of having to sell the place in those kind of more simple terms. I think bringing sensory language and individual experience into it as much as you can, really bringing that kind of individual narrative focus in, maybe will guide the language so it's a little bit more reflective of your true experiences. And also just talking to people on the ground, I would say, as much as possible, instead of having that kind of exterior gaze where you come in and take in a place and just write off of that brief experience, avoiding that kind of more helicopter journalism feel and really talking to people and seeing what it's actually like on the ground. Again, I think that's hard because your editor there might have an investment towards a certain narrative, and there's only so much you can veer away from that. But I think those two strategies might hopefully make it feel at least a little bit more crunchy and real. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Chris, I've got a question that came in from Jason that I think you might have a unique perspective on. So Jason's asking about basically taking notes, remembering things, maybe even doing some writing during a trip in order to kind of really bring things to life. He's curious about hacks that people may have. So others on the call, feel free to jump in. But Chris, the reason why I wanted to pose this to you is because you're very active on social media. Between Twitter and Instagram. I am curious, when you're visiting a place and you're being proactive in terms of not using your phone to take yourself out of that place, but to capture these moments, how does that help you maybe relive those things after the fact?
Oh, I mean, it's absolutely crucial for me to I may look disengaged when I'm at a brewery because I'm like deep in my phone, trying to, craft the right words to describe my experience there, and then also taking pictures. I honestly I tend to have a more photographic memory, and while I have absolutely no skills as a photographer, as can be seen in my Instagram feed, it's still a great way for me to remember a place. I'll remember, like, when I see pictures in my social media feed of breweries and I've been to that brewery, I immediately know which brewery it is just based on that, or at least know that I've been there. So I think it's taking at least some time away to script your initial thoughts about the experience and give some time to digest it. Oftentimes when I'm visiting multiple breweries in a day, while I'm in transit from one brewery to the next, that will be my time to kind of absorb the experience and explain my experience on social media. That's generally the way I do things. For looking back at a city as a whole, really the first thing that I do when I get back from a trip is just look through my photos. And sometimes there'll be photos that I just like casually took that really capture the experience. Like I would say for this trip, it was a picture of a glass of Helles right by the French Broad River at Silicoa yesterday. It really encapsulated the experience, just the crispness in the air. You could feel it, like just in the picture, and there are no leaves on the trees, and even the water looks cold in the river, and I feel like things like that can really help like I will I will look at that picture again and be able to come up with the same words, a month from now, maybe, if I sit down and write about Asheville. So
Jason, this is perhaps like the most millennial thing that I could say about this, because for my Instagram account, it's basically almost exclusively I'll use it when I'm traveling for a lot of the reasons that Chris is saying here. I take photos almost exclusively when I'm traveling. But one of the things I also do is it's the rare time I'll actually also use the stories feature on Instagram. And one of the things I like about that is because if I'm capturing things to put to my stories while I'm traveling, I still have access to that full archive at any point. So I can go back to the trip I went to Ireland in right before COVID hit. In December 2019, and I can find the list of videos and photos in my Instagram stories archives that helps to bring some of those memories back. So it's kind of like a backdoor hack in a way that I think has helped me with some of that, aside from just I've got like a little Moleskine handheld notebook that I literally does not leave my side when I'm traveling for fun or for work. Claire, for the travel writing that you've done, what's your process, especially when you're thinking about things in such descriptive terms? How do you handle note taking and memory?
Yeah, so I think my advice probably isn't super different from what you both have already said, but I think I mainly focus on gathering rather than processing while I'm in the experience. So as you say, I'll take lots of photos. I have an app on my phone that I use to record things. So I'll record conversations. Maybe I'll even, leave myself little voice notes about things that I'm experiencing. But once I've taken those photos or made those recordings, I don't think about them again. They're locked up now. They're there. That archive exists, because living in that present moment is still just as important, I think, as Jason has said. So once I'm comfortable and know that I have the material, I don't need to think about it again until maybe several weeks later. And I think it actually does really help to let it percolate, let it marinate. And then only once you're home and you've fully experienced it and you've had time for that to digest, can you reflect back in a way that feels kind of true and honest and all encompassing of that experience. And that's when I will tend to go back through my photos to remind myself of exactly how something looked, go back in my notes and recordings. And that's sort of an interesting moment, because at the same time that you're going back to your photos, you realize how much the brain has already embroidered and changed. So, I might think a tap room looks a certain way. And then I look at my photo, I'm like, oh yeah, the walls were not blue, they were red, and just small details. So it's that's almost an interesting, like, meta memory game you can play with yourself. And I think sometimes leaning into that tension could be sort of interesting too,
Yeah,
like between expectation and truth.
it sounds like similar to so much in life these days, is that it takes the actual conscious choice to have to be present in that particular moment, of which in whatever experience in life, I'm sure we all have some kind of connection, whether it's like literally just putting your phone down and looking at the sunset. Anybody else have any questions? I've got some more, but does anybody have anything to ask of Chris and Claire in particular?
Yeah, hey, I have a question. My one like real big beef with travel writing is that it can get so rote, especially when you're going to a location that like a lot of people have gone to and everyone's writing about the same thing. How do you make sure like what you're writing is individuated enough that like you're not getting caught in those same traps of just like repeating the same, I think, glossy bullshit that someone else said before?
Chris, do you want to handle that one first, based on the fact that you do travel so many places that there have probably been dozens of stories written about?
Oh yeah. I think that sometimes most of the writing that I've done that's been in the travel realm has been very service oriented. So I'm very much just like, here's the bullets, here's here's the breweries you should visit and why. It is hard because I think it really depends on what the consumer of the writing is trying to get out of it. Like when I'm reading travel pieces, I really need to know the information first and foremost, because usually I'm seeking out pieces about the places I'm planning on going to. So in those instances, I think it's more service based than just the facts. I think when you're writing about places in the sense that you're trying to inspire people to go to those places, that's where a little bit of uh, 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 falling into routine is very easy, but providing some sort of context for why this is a place you should visit, or what made your experience at that place unique and it's something you want to share. I think I, I am definitely guilty of falling into that. I don't think I've used off the beaten path or hidden gem, Claire, but you know what? If you go far enough back in my Instagram feed, I've probably used that to describe a brewery or two. But yeah, I think it really is first and foremost coming up with a gem, of something that is unique to your experience that you want to share with everyone. And yeah, you may fall into some of the old traps, but I don't necessarily think that's bad in terms of providing service journalism to, to people who are just looking for the highlights. I mean, in a city like Asheville, I think there's you can never write too many pieces about the breweries here, and because there are so many, you could have 5 different people write about 5 different, 5 breweries each, and still not cover all the breweries here, and each have a very different experience.
I want to mention something, Claire. I'm going to kick it to you to get some thoughts about something similar to this. Is that so? Regardless of whether you're a sports fan or not, this upcoming week, so the Super Bowl for the NFL is next weekend. And one of the most fascinating weeks of sports journalism takes place over these next 7 days. Because you will have hundreds of people descending on what is arguably the most prominent American sports event of the year. And all of those journalists have to do something different. Where if you're looking at, say, an AP story during Super Bowl week, they're going to have multiple stories every day about individual players or game planning, things like that. And the reason I share this is that this theme of you've got everybody in one place writing about the same thing, but they have to do something completely different. And that comes back to a lot of just the legwork that takes in terms of just doing good reporting. You could probably find a whole bunch of examples of journalists writing about their experience Super Bowl week, where you're at the same press conference, you're talking to the same exact people, but you got to try to figure out a different angle than competitor X or Y. So if you're looking for inspiration, whether you like football or not, I just bring that up as something to maybe poke around a little bit this week, just to get it kind of going in your head. Claire, I want to take the base of that question and come back to something that you had said when we first started talking, that it's more important now to reconsider everything we do when it comes to travel writing, which I think is also a case of finding that thing that is different. Could you maybe give a little bit more depth to that, about what you mean that we need to reconsider things, both about what we're writing, where we're writing, who we're talking to, things like that?
Yeah, so I think some of the advice that we've talked about already applies to this. Some of it is being as specific to your personal experience as possible, bringing in the sensory information, bringing in, the kind of unvarnished truth of your experience is really important. Talking to lots of people on the ground and moving beyond just the kind of expected people. Instead of talking to like the celebrity chef, can you talk to his staff? Instead of talking to the PR person, can you talk to the person working the front desk of the hotel? Whatever it is, I think reaching beyond the kind of more kind of classical sanitized channels is always really important. And I think a lot of it also is kind of coming in really humble and curious as much as you can without any kind of prior narrative in your head about what you're expecting will happen. I often come in this way that is really questioning of myself and my own motives. So, in that Croatia piece, for instance, or in the piece I wrote more recently, which was published last year about going to Western Norway and visiting some of the farmhouse brewers who are using kvike out there. I have a moment in both of those pieces where I share the narrative I was sort of expecting. Croatia is kind of the turquoise waters, the perfect tourist destination. Western Norway is kind of this cottagecore coziness, these guys out in the woods. And I explicitly address my own kind of biases and preconceptions there. And then I go back and and hold those up to what has actually happened. Because in both cases, there's sort of the facade and then there's the reality. The facade of Croatia is as this really polished, perfect paradise tourist destination. What does it look like underneath that? What's actually happening in the beer scene? What are the pressures on the local population as tourists kind of continually invade this place to an extent that they are sometimes outnumber the local population 6-1? That's kind of interesting. What does that feel like to live under that sort of dynamic? Or in Western Norway, like, oh, these guys are cozily brewing beer in the woods in these cabins. Isn't that lovely? Well, actually, it's backbreaking work. It's punishing. It's hard. It's cold. Like, experiencing that for myself completely changed my understanding of it. So I would approach your own perspective and motivations with as much skepticism as anything else, because you yourself are very fallible. So yeah, that's kind of my main advice there. Obviously, I would like to see us broadly move away from legacy publications and towards more small independent publications that are invested in those new perspectives. I'm interested in seeing more people of color in the industry. I'm interested in seeing people writing from the places they live in rather than having that kind of parachute helicopter journalism all the time, moving away from that kind of standard. So I think there's kind of broader, more systemic industry-wide stuff I want to see, but there's also small perspective changes that we can ourselves bring into our own writing.
I'm going to ask one more question from what Ron had posed in the chat. Thanks, Ron. And then I have to run, but I will encourage anybody, if you'd like to stick around, please do. So we kicked off this 5W series talking about when, thinking about history, the value of history, and the way that kind of functions in our writing. And one of the really important questions that we talked about with Liz Garibay and Maureen Ogle were like, does that matter? Because it matters in terms of the stories we're telling, but we also have to consider about it, especially when we're, say, making pitches and things like that, about what the reader wants, what the editor wants, what the publication normally shares. So Ron, I hear you. I think about the same thing too. When I travel to new places, I try to have pieces of history mixed in with contemporary as well. Chris and Claire, maybe Claire, we'll stick with you for this one. When we talk about travel writing, how much might history need to play a part on what might say an average piece? If we're writing about visiting a place and experiencing it, are you looking for thinking about that kind of thing?
I'd love to have more of that perspective, to be honest, because I think so much travel writing up until now has been incredibly siloed. The scope of the piece is basically your 5-day trip to that place, and that's it. We often are left without a lot of that local context, or maybe we have little factoids dropped in, or I saw this thing that was really old, cool, but basically trying to better understand the story and context of the place is key to telling an honest story of it, or creating an honest portrait of it. In addition to speaking to multiple sources beyond, again, the traditional kind of, press junket types, if you can. So absolutely, I'd love for more historical context to be brought into travel writing, and more historical context to understand the kind of power imbalances and inequities and problems of travel writing as a practice in the first place.
Chris,
I was going to add to that actually.
I was going to ask, actually, if on top of what you might have in mind, I'm curious about, because I want to like complement that too. When you're thinking about consuming travel writing, what kind of history do you enjoy reading about?
I like the. I mean, the history that gives me the context to maybe appreciate the experience that the writer is having is probably what's most important to me. Um, but in terms of both travel and beer, I've I've found really interesting trends that are rooted in history that kind of shape a city's beer scene. If you think about the pioneers in craft beer in the 1980s, oftentimes they've created a family tree of brewing in that town where people worked for that brewery and then started their own, and they hired people and those people left and started their own. So I think there's a story to be told there. One of the more fascinating historical things, and when we're talking history, we're only talking like 30 or 40 years of craft beer history in the US, but in Montana, virtually every brewery makes a Scotch ale. Like, I can't even, I think I've seen one Scotch ale on this entire trip in Asheville, but every brewery in Montana makes a Scotch ale. And when I finally got to the root of that, it was because Kettle House Brewing, which was one of the first breweries in Montana, one of the first craft breweries at least, their flagship beer was a Scotch ale. And that's why everyone makes a Scotch ale. and I feel like that's a fun little nugget to share with readers that can kind of help guide their experience, because it's like, all right, well, now we're on the quest to find out who has the best Scotch ale in Montana. And I was actually at the brewery that won the gold medal in the Scotch ale category at the Montana State Beer Competition. As they won it, and the bartenders were jumping up and down with joy. so I feel like those kind of nuggets provide some pretty interesting context in as far as how a city's beer scene has evolved.
I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to run. I know we're coming up. We're a little bit over an hour now. Chris, I'll start with you. Claire, then we'll finish with you. As you think about what travel means in the near future, what's a location that you feel most interested in learning about?
For me, it's places. I mean, in the context of beer, it's places that I would never think would have a good beer scene, or places that are known for an alcoholic beverage other than beer, but are also producing beer that may have its roots in that beverage. I think maybe like 9 or 10 years ago, that was, people writing about Scandinavian beer and emerging breweries there. Now, I mean, I think it's just really places that I wouldn't associate with beer that have that have a beer scene worth exploring. And I mean, I've even found that within the US, like there's cities that I think have fantastic beer scenes that are never talked about, in the same breath as like Asheville or San Diego or Denver and Boulder. But like, I mean, Salt Lake City has a fantastic beer scene that is, in fact, like it's hampered by the regulatory system in Utah, but it's still a fantastic beer scene. So I think that those are the places I want to see what's next. Like, what are the places that we'll be talking about in 5 to 10 years that we're really not talking about now? And I don't want to say that I like to say that I went there before, like I was there before it was cool. But I mean, those are the places that that I have the best experiences. Like I could go to San Diego and spend 2 weeks there visiting breweries, and I'm going to come. But what stories am I going to come out of that trip? I don't think there's going to be much that's particularly interesting because unless a specific brewery has a good story to tell. But I want a place where the city is part of the story, even when it is about beer.
Claire, post-COVID, what's a place personally, maybe as well as editor, that you think is interesting to you that you'd love to learn about?
When you first asked that question, I can tell I've been cooped up too long because I immediately was like, Australia, no New Zealand, no Vietnam, no Mexico, no. There's so many places I want to go. But I actually almost feel like some of the writing I was doing right before COVID, I feel like has been interrupted, and I kind of want to get back to it. Like going to Norway and seeing those breweries in action was so interesting to me, and talking to people like Lars Marius Garshol and learning more about this kind of strain of farmhouse brewing that it still exists. So I'd love to go to some of the other places he mentions, like Lithuania, Russia, different parts of the Nordics in general. I'm super interested in almost kind of following in his footsteps and seeing what else is happening there because it's fascinating. Ditto actually with the Balkans. I really loved Croatia, and I met a few breweries there, a few Slovenian breweries actually, that I would love to go and visit and talk to. So those are both regions that I kind of feel like I started exploring, and then the door slammed. So I kind of want to pick that back up again as things start easing off.
A few key takeaways from this chat. Thank you, Chris and Claire. Again, Claire, I think talking about descriptive tips, the way that we're thinking about soundtracks and senses, the way that you would put it, the way we talked about it. I also really appreciate talking to people who don't own the place or brew at the place. Think about that cellar person who's walking by you. I think that is a really good way to think about telling unique stories. Chris gave the story pitch ideas, small towns, as the next big interest during this COVID summer here in the US. Someone needs to beat Kate Renat on Scotch Ale in Montana.